The blade broke on a Tuesday. Marin felt it from 3 miles away, inside the healer's room where she was pressing a poultice against old Harold Finch's infected shoulder, and the snap of it moved through the air like a crack of code, not sound, not exactly, but something that lived in the chest and pulled. She kept her hands still. Harold did not need to know that the most sacred object in the Asheville Park had just shattered like cheap glass on a battlefield she was not allowed to enter. She finished with Harold. She washed her hands. She walked out of the healer's building into the gray morning and looked at the tree line and waited. The warriors came back 40 minutes later. 12 of them rode through the park gate carrying the 2 pieces of the Fang blade wrapped in a cloth the color of old blood. Behind them, the Alpha Second, a broad man named Cole Drummond, sat straight in his saddle-like posture alone could undo what had happened. His face said something different. His face said they had lost something that could not simply be replaced. Marin watched from the doorway. Not because she was invited to watch. Because the healer's building sat at the edge of the main path, and watching required no invitation when you were already there. Cole dismounted and looked over at her. "Council meeting," he said. "You are needed." She had been to 3 council meetings in 12 years. Once when a fever swept through the Pops quarter and the Alpha needed to understand why. Once when a healer from a rival park was accused of poisoning their water supply and Marin was asked to confirm the symptoms. Once when she had made the mistake of saving a wolf the Alpha had quietly decided could be allowed to die, and the council needed to determine whether that counted as defiance. She had learned to take up very little space in that room. The council chamber smelled of pine resin and anxiety. 14 people sat or stood around the long table, and when Marin came in, most of them looked at her the way people look at a tool they did not know they would need today. Alpha Gregor Asheville stood at the head of the table, both halves of the Fang blade laid in front of him on the cloth. He was a tall man with the kind of still face that came not from combat but from long practice at hiding what he felt. "Marin," he said. "Tell them what you know about blood price reforging." She had been expecting this the moment Cole called her name outside. She had spent the 40 minutes of the warrior's ride home pulling the knowledge out of the back of her mind where she kept things that were dangerous to know. "It is a ritual," she said. "Old. Older than this pack. The blade is not just steel, it carries the pack's bond, the healer's thread, the Alpha line. When it breaks from too much contact with dark bonded magic, ordinary forge work cannot seal it. The shards will not hold. The only way to restore it is to fill the break with living energy. With something that is willingly given." "Given how?" said a woman named Ruth Calloway, who ran the park's southern border patrol and had no patience for anything she could not ride toward. "Drawn out through the hands," Marin said. "Over 3 nights. The smith uses a ritual circle. The person who offers their energy sits in the center. What is drawn out does not come back." "Meaning they die," said Cole. "Meaning they lose what was taken. If they offer wolf sense, they lose it. If they offer bone pool, it goes. If they offer enough of either, yes, they can die. It depends on how much the blade requires." Silence sat down on the room. Gregor looked at his warriors. The warriors looked at the table. Marin watched the silence move around like water finding the lowest point, and she already knew where it was going to settle, and she felt something in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite peace but lived somewhere between the two. "We need volunteers," Gregor said. Nobody moved. She understood it. She did not blame them. The Fang blade was important, yes, but it was a symbol, and symbols were difficult to love more than your own body's ability to feel the pack around you. Bone pool was not an abstraction. It was the warmth that told you where your family stood. It was the invisible thread that pulled you home in the dark. Asking someone to give that up for a piece of steel was asking more than most people had to give. Gregor looked at the warriors again. Then at the border patrol captains. Then at the 2 council elders who were old enough to remember when the blade had last been drawn in real battle, which was before most of the people in this room were born. Then he looked at Marin. She was already looking at him. "I will do it," she said. Not loudly. Not as a declaration. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without decoration, as though the words were a diagnosis. Ruth Calloway looked at her across the table. You are the pack's only healer. I know what I am. If something goes wrong during the ritual, I know the ritual better than anyone in this pack. If something goes wrong, I will be the most qualified person in the room to address it. She paused. And nothing will go wrong. The blade needs living energy freely given. I am giving it freely. That is the condition. Freely is what matters. Gregor studied her face for a long moment. He was looking for something, a doubt, maybe, or hidden pressure, some sign that she was doing this because she felt she had no choice. She gave him nothing to read because there was nothing to read. She had made the calculation the moment she heard the blade break, standing in the healer's room with her hands on Harold Finch's shoulder, and the calculation was simple. The blade needed a life force, the warriors needed theirs, and Marin's had never belonged entirely to her anyway. 12 years of pouring herself into this pack's wounds had already shown her that. This was only more honest. You understand what you are offering, Gregor said. It was not a question, but he needed to say it. Yes. And you are choosing this without coercion. I am choosing it without coercion. He looked at the blade. At the clean break across its middle, the sheared edge that had once held centuries of pack-bond energy and now held nothing but the smell of dark magic and cold iron. Then it is accepted, he said. We begin at moonrise. Nobody in the room said well done or thank you or we will remember this. That was fine. Marin had not done it for any of those things. She gathered her coat from the back of her chair and walked out of the council chamber into the late morning light, and stood for a moment in the quiet between the buildings, and breathed. The pack moved around her like a river around a stone. Wolves going about their day, children running between the storage buildings, a group of young warriors pouring near the east gate with the loose-limbed energy of people who did not yet know what the morning had decided. Marin watched them and felt something she did not have a clean name for. Not regret. Not pride. Something smaller and more private than either. She went back to the healer's room. Harold Finch was asleep in the chair where she had left him. She checked his shoulder, changed the poultice, and began sorting her supply shelves, because the supply shelves needed sorting and the ritual was not until moonrise and there was no use in standing in a field being meaningful about it. She worked until late afternoon. She ate a small meal alone in the back room. She wrote out her patient notes in the leather book she kept under the table, Harold's shoulder, the Brennan boy's broken finger, old Mary Voss's breathing trouble, in careful, even handwriting, noting what each patient would need over the coming week and where the relevant medicines were stored. She left the notes on the table where anyone taking over the healer's duties would find them without having to look. At dusk, Cole came to the door. He stood outside it without knocking for a moment, which was unusual for a man who generally treated a door as something to go through, not something to consider. Come in or don't, Marin said, without looking up from the notes. He came in. He looked at the supply shelves, at the notes on the table, at the patient in the chair. He looked at Marin. You sorted the shelves, he said. They needed sorting. You wrote out the patient notes. They needed writing. Cole sat down on the stool near the door, which was not something he had ever done before. He was a large man in a small chair and he looked somewhat ridiculous and did not seem to care. You don't have to do this. You said that in the council meeting. Several of you said it in several different ways. I'm saying it now as something other than a council member. Marin put down her pen. She looked at him. Cole Drummond had been a fair second to Gregor for a decade, and he had never once asked her what she wanted or how she felt about anything, not because he was a cruel man but because the pack's hierarchy did not require him to, and he had not needed to override that habit until this moment. Cole, she said. Do you know why I became a healer? He shook his head. Because it was the one role in this pack where being used was the point. Where giving everything you had was not a failing but a function. She said it quietly, without bitterness. I have spent 12 years being useful. I know how to be useful. I do not know how to be anything else, and I stopped trying to learn a long time ago. This is not a sacrifice. It is just the most honest version of what I already am. Cole looked at the floor. then at her. Then at the notes on the table. He left without another word. The sky went dark. The moon came up hard and clear over the tree line, and Marion walked to the forge at the edge of the park compound where the park smith, a quiet man named Owen Hale, had already drawn the ritual circle in ember iron dust on the park dirt floor. The circle glowed faintly, not with fire but with something older than fire, something that had been waiting in the heart of this place since before the park had a name. Owen looked at her when she came in. He was not a man who wasted words. He said, "Sit in the center. Put your hands flat on the ground. Don't pull away from it, whatever it feels like. If you pull away, it breaks the draw and we have to start over." "I understand," she said. She sat in the center of the circle. She put her hands flat on the ground. The ember iron dust was warm under her palms, warmer than the night around it, and when one began the first words of the ritual, she felt the warmth move up through her hands and into her wrist and felt something in her chest recognize it and lean toward it the way a flame leans toward air. She did not pull away. The first night, it took her sense of cold and warmth. She could no longer feel the temperature of the air around her. She did not move. The second night, it took the faint inner hum that told her when a pack member was nearby. The bond sense. The wolf radar that most wolves never thought about because it was as constant as breathing. Gone by the third hour. She sat in its absence and catalogued what it felt like, the way she would catalogue a patient's symptom, and then she put it away and kept her hands on the ground. The third night was longer. By the time one said dawn in the grey light before dawn, Marion's hands were shaking. Not from pain. From the particular exhaustion of having held very still through something that wanted her to move. She looked at the blade. Oh. Seamless. The break was gone as though it had never been, and the steel had a quality it had not had before, a depth, like looking at still water and knowing it went further down than you could see. Owen lifted it carefully. He turned it once in the early light. "It took well," he said. Marion stood up. Her legs held. She walked to the door of the forge and looked out at the park compound waking up in the early morning, smoke from cook fires, a dog running between two buildings, the distant sound of children. She listened for the bond pull. That familiar warmth that told her where her pack was. Nothing. Just air. Just the sound of things that were real and visible and nothing more. She pulled her coat tighter, not because she was cold. She could no longer tell if she was cold. She walked back to the healer's room. Harold Finch was still there, asleep, his shoulder healing well. She picked up her pen. She had 3 patients to see before noon. The blade sat in Owen's forge, whole and waiting, and it smelled, very faintly, of something that had once been Marion, warm and careful and already moving on to the next person who needed her. 2 weeks passed. Marion learned the shape of her new silence the way you learn the shape of a room you have to live in whether you like it or not. She stopped reaching for the bond pole. She stopped turning her head when a pack member walked past, waiting for the warmth that used to arrive automatically, an internal compass that always knew where north was. That compass was gone, and the place where it had been was not painful, exactly. It was just empty in the way a shelf is empty when you have given away the thing that lived on it for years. She treated Harold Finch's shoulder. She set the Brennan boy's finger. She brewed the tincture for Mary Voss's breeding 3 mornings a week. She sorted the supply shelves. She wrote the patient notes. She was the healer, and the healer kept working, and so she worked. Nobody asked her how she felt. She had not expected them to. What she had not expected was the morning Gregor called the pack to the main yard. She came out of the healer's room at the sound of the gathering bell, which rang only for pack announcements, and saw 200 wolves standing in the morning light in a rough circle around the clearing. Gregor stood at the center. Beside him, Co. Behind them both, a group of riders that Marion did not recognize, and at the head of that group, a man on a grey horse who sat with a kind of stillness that was not calm but command. She did not need the bond pole to read that room. The Fang blade sat on a cloth on a stand beside Gregor, the way a gift is displayed before it is given. Marion stood at the edge of the gathered crowd and understood, without anyone having told her, that the blade was about to leave. Gregor began speaking. He spoke of the border war to the north, of the pack law that required tribute when a larger power intervened in a territorial dispute, of the honor of offering your finest and most sacred object as a sign of good faith. He spoke clearly and with the measured tone of a man who had already made the decision and was now explaining it to the people who would have to live with it. He did not look at Marion while he spoke. He did not look at Owen. He looked at the man on the grey horse, who was watching him with the patient attention of someone who already knew how the speech ended. The man on the grey horse was Caden Voss. Marion knew the name. Everyone in every pack within 3 territories knew the name. The Alpha King. Not a title anyone had voted on or ceremonially granted, a title that had been earned, the way blades were earned, through enough tests that eventually the testing stopped because the outcome was no longer in doubt. He was younger than she had imagined. That was the first thing she noticed. Younger, and very still, and looking at Gregor with a kind of focused attention that was either respect or its precise opposite, and from this distance she could not tell which. He dismounted when Gregor finished speaking. He was tall on the ground, which she had half expected, and moved through the space between his horses and the tribute stand with an economy of motion that said he had been watched his whole life and had stopped performing for the watching some time ago. Gregor lifted the blade from the cloth and held it out. Caden Voss looked at it for a long moment. He reached out and took it. Turned it once in the light, the way Owen had turned it in the forge, and the morning light moved across the steel and showed its depth, that quality it had now of being more than it looked. He belted it at his hip. Like it was useful. Like it was simply a blade and he was a man who carried blades and now he carried this one. Marion watched his hand settle the belt and watched the blade settle against his thigh and felt nothing. The absence where feeling used to be. She had been noting these absences the way she noted symptoms, clinically, without flinching. No bone pull when the pack stirred around her. No warmth read when she touched the patient's skin. And now no, whatever this should have been, watching her offering get strapped to a stranger's hip without a word of explanation about what it had cost. Nothing. Just the morning air, and the sound of a horse shifting its weight, and the blade at his side looking like it had always been there. She turned to go back to the healer's building. Caden Voss looked up. She did not know why he looked up at that specific moment. The pack was gathered all around him, 200 wolves, their alpha, his own riders. There was no reason his eyes should have moved to the one person at the edge of the crowd who was turning away from the ceremony. But they did. He looked at her for no more than 3 seconds. She did not look away because she had not done anything that required looking away, and she had long ago stopped performing the kind of deference that the powerful often expected from the invisible. She met his gaze with the same steady attention she gave a wound she was assessing. He looked at the healer's building behind her. Then at her face again. Then one of his riders said something to him in a low voice, and his attention moved, and Marion walked back inside and closed the door and looked at Harold Finch's shoulder and said, "Healing well. You can go home tomorrow." Harold said, "Was that the Alpha King out there?" "Yes." "What did he want?" "A blade," she said. "He got one." She put the notes back under the table. She brewed the morning tincture for Mary Voss. She did not think about the way the steel had caught the light, or the 3 seconds of being seen by someone who had no reason to see her, or the fact that the piece of herself she had most carefully given away was now strapped against a stranger's leg and riding north. She thought about Harold's shoulder. She thought about the Brennan boy's finger. She thought about Mary Voss's breathing. She was the healer. She kept walking. The first report came from the northern border 4 days after Caden Voss left with the blade. A patrol rider arrived at the Ashvale compound at dusk, his horse hard-ridden and his face carrying the look of someone who had been asked to deliver news he did not entirely believe. He asked for Alpha Gregor. He was taken to the council chamber. The door was closed. Marion heard about it from Cole the next morning, which was not standard procedure, which meant Cole had decided on his own to tell her, which was itself unusual enough that she put down what she was doing and listened. "The Alpha King's people are saying the blade moved," Cole said. He was standing in the door of the healer's room again, in the same position he had been when he came to talk her out of the ritual. He had not sat on the small stool this time. Marion looked at him. moved how? Not on its own. Or, not exactly. The king was riding through a field camp near the Vos-Hero borderline, and one of his young soldiers had been knocked from his horse and was lying in the grass with a broken leg, and nobody had seen it yet because the camp was busy and the grass was long. The king's horse would have ridden over him. Cole paused. But the blade pulled to the right. The king said it felt like someone had gripped his sword hand and steered it. He turned the horse. He found the boy. Marin said nothing. His war council is calling it a haunted blade, Cole said. His bloodseer is saying it's a soul bond. That someone's living energy is still active in the steel. Another pause. She says it responds to need. That it knows when someone is hurt. Marin picked up the pen she had put down. That is consistent, she said, with the nature of a healer's energy. Cole looked at her for a moment. He is coming back. She put the pen down again. He sent a rider ahead this morning. He is 3 days out and he wants answers about what was done to the blade before it was given to him. Cole's voice was carefully without inflection, the way his voice got when he was managing something he was not sure how to manage. Gregor has asked that you be present for the meeting. Of course he has, Marin said. Not bitterly. Just accurately. Marin. 3 days, she said. I have 3 days of work to do before then. Let me do it. He left. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the healer's room and looked at her hands. They were steady. They had been steady since the forge, through all 3 nights, through the taking of her warmth sense and her bond sense. She had not let them shake where anyone could see. They were a healer's hands. They stayed steady by design. She thought about the field camp, and the boy in the long grass, and the blade pulling a horseman's hand to the right. She thought about a piece of herself, loose in a stranger's scabbard, still doing what it knew how to do. She went back to work. 3 days passed. She treated a shoulder strain in one of Ruth Calloway's patrol riders. She addressed a burn on a child named Penny who had gotten too close to the cook fire and whose mother held the girl's opposite hand and talked very fast about how it had happened, as though speed of explanation might reduce the size of the burn. It did not. Marin treated the burn with the same steady attention she gave everything, and by the end of the session Penny was calm and the mother had slowed down. That was also part of the work. On the morning of the 3rd day, she heard the riders at the gate. Caden Voss came into the Asheville compound with 6 of his own people and no performance of arrival. No fanfare, no formation. He came through the gate the way a man comes through a door when he has been in enough places that arriving somewhere new does not require theater. Marin watched from the healer's doorway. He went directly to the council chamber. So did Gregor, and Cole, and the council members who had been quietly alerted since morning. Marin washed her hands, dried them on the cloth beside the basin, and walked to the council chamber at her own pace. When she came in, everyone was already seated except Caden Voss, who was standing at the head of the table in the spot that was usually Gregor's, not because he had taken it but because it was where the light from the high window fell and he had simply stood in the light. Gregor had taken the chair beside it without apparent difficulty. That said something about both men. The Fang blade was on the table in front of Caden. He looked at Marin when she came in. The same look as in the yard, 3 seconds, steady, assessing rather than performing. You are the healer, he said. Yes. Sit down, he said, and there was nothing in it that was a request, but there was also nothing in it that was contempt. It was the tone of someone who needed the conversation to move at a useful speed. She sat. He put his hand on the blade. He did not draw it. He just rested his palm on the hilt, and the table went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone does something simple that turns out to matter. 3 nights ago, he said, I was walking the perimeter of the South Camp after midnight. Alone. Which I am told I should not do, but I have been told that for 16 years and it has not changed the habit. He looked at the table. One of my senior war captains was on the far side of the tree line with a chest wound from a sparring accident that had gone wrong. He had not called for help because he did not want to be pulled from active duty. He was bleeding quietly and intending to manage it himself. Caden paused. The blade turned me. Physically. My feet were pointed toward the camp. The blade had other ideas. I followed it because it was easier than arguing with it, and I found Captain Dre against a tree with 2 broken ribs and a cut that needed immediate attention. He looked at Maren. My bloodseer says there is a healer's soul woven into this steel. She says whoever sat in the forge gave something that does not go dormant. It keeps working. He looked around the table at the council. I want to know whose it is. And I want to know if that person is aware that they are still working from inside my scabbard. The table was silent. Gregor looked at Maren. Everyone at the table looked at Maren. She was already looking at Caden Voss. She was looking at the blade on the table in front of him. She was looking at the way his hand rested on the hilt, and she was thinking, with the detached clinical part of her mind that kept working even when the rest of her was occupied, that the grip of his hand on the hilt was the same angle as her palms had been on the floor of the forge on those 3 nights, and that was probably not a coincidence. She felt something move in her right hand. Not pulling. Not the old bond sense returning. Something smaller. A faint warmth at the base of her palm, the way a scar sometimes warms in the cold, reminding you of what used to be there. She looked at her hand. She looked at the blade. 3 inches. She stopped. She put her hand flat on the table, pressing it down deliberately. Caden Voss had watched all of it. Every inch. It is yours, she said. Her voice was even. She had long practice at even. The energy in the blade is mine. I sat in the forge for 3 nights and gave it what it needed to be whole. That is what a blood price reforging requires. A willing life force. She looked at him without apology. I was not aware it would keep doing what it was doing after the ritual. That is a new piece of information. The room was very quiet. Caden said, "Did you know what you were given?" "Yes." "Did you know it would go into my possession specifically?" "No." "I knew it would be used. I assumed it would be used in this park. Where it went after that was not my decision. But it is still your energy." "It appears to be, yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the blade. Then at his hand on the hilt. He said, "Does it hurt you?" "When it works." She blinked. It was the first question she had not been prepared for. In all the things she had rehearsed on her way to this room, the explanations, the park law citations, the clinical descriptions of the ritual, nobody in her imagination had asked her that. "No," she said. "I cannot feel what it does. I gave the bond sense in the second night. I gave the warmth sense in the first. What is in the blade, I no longer have access to." She looked at the table. "It works. I just do not feel it working." Something crossed Caden Voss's face that she did not have a name for. He picked up the blade. He turned it once in the light from the high window, and the depth in the steel moved the way water moves, and he was quiet for long enough that the room started to feel the weight of his silence. He said, "I have questions." "I imagine so," Maren said. "Not for the council." He looked at her directly. "For you. Tonight. Is that possible?" Gregor looked between them. He was calculating something behind his still face, politics, probably, and what it meant that an alpha king wanted a private meeting with his pack's healer. He said, "That can be arranged." Maren said, "Yes. That is possible." She did not ask what the questions were. She had her own. She looked at the blade one more time before Caden covered it with his hand again. She felt the warmth at the base of her palm again. Faint. Distant. Like hearing your name called from very far away. She pressed her hand flat on the table. The meeting adjourned. She had 3 patients to see before evening. The council chamber was empty by the time she came back. They had agreed on the hall room, a small room of the main building that was used for private park meetings, with 2 chairs and a fire that had been lit by whoever Cole had sent ahead to prepare it. Maren arrived first. She sat in the chair nearer the fire, not because she could feel its warmth but because she had spent enough winters knowing where fires were that the habit was older than the sense it relied on. Caden Voss came in alone, which she had not been certain he would do. He had the kind of position that made people nervous about leaving him without protection, and those people often expressed their nervousness by insisting on being present even when the room had specifically been arranged otherwise. He had apparently told them something convincing. He sat in the opposite chair. He had the blade at his hip. He had not offered to leave it outside, and she had not expected him to. It would have felt wrong, probably, to both of them in ways neither of them would have been able to explain quickly. He said, "How long ago did you do the ritual?" 6 weeks, she said. "And before tonight, had anyone asked you how you were?" She looked at the fire. She had an answer, but it was the kind of answer that required care about how it was shaped, because the true answer was no, and the true answer also carried the weight of 12 years that were not his business and that she had not been asked to explain. "I am the healer," she said. "People bring me their hurting. That is the arrangement." "That is not an answer." "No," she said. "It is not." He was quiet for a moment. The fire moved between them. "My blood seer," he said, "has been trying to understand the blade for 6 weeks. She says the energy in it is not just power. It is a particular kind of attention. She says it reads a room the way a good healer reads a room, looking for where the damage is, moving toward it before anyone has asked it to." He looked at Maren. "She says whoever gave this has been doing it their whole life. Giving before being asked. Moving toward damage as a first instinct, not a second." Maren said nothing. "She also says," he said, more quietly, "that the person this came from has almost nothing left for themselves. That the blade is full and the person it came from is running on what remains." The fire crackled. Maren kept her eyes on it. She was not going to argue with the bloodseer's reading. She was a healer. She knew what the bloodseer had seen. She had been watching it happen to herself for years with the same clinical detachment she applied to everything else. "What do you want?" she said. "You said you had questions." "That reads as an observation, not a question." "I want to know what you want." She looked at him. "In return for this," he said. He put his hand on the blade at his hip, not drawing it, just acknowledging it. "You gave something that is still active and still working and has saved at least 3 lives in 6 weeks that I know of. You gave it without being paid. Without being thanked. Without being told where it was going." His voice did not carry anger. Just a careful honesty. "I want to know what would make this fair. Or as close to fair as it can get, which is probably not very close, but I would rather know than not." Maren opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at the fire. She had never once, in 12 years of being asked what medicine someone needed, what treatment would help, what the pack required, been asked what she wanted. She had not noticed the shape of that absence until this moment, when someone was asking her to feel it and she discovered she did not know how. Her mind went to the supply shelves. To the patient notes. To Harold Finch and Penny's burn and Mary Voss's breathing. She reached for the wanting the way she reached for the bond pool, automatically, and found the same emptiness. Caden watched her face through all of it. "You do not know," he said. Not a judgment. "No," she said. "I do not know." He nodded, slowly, as though this was an answer he had half expected and had already decided what to do with. "Then I am staying," he said. She looked up. "Not as a political arrangement. Not because the border war requires it, though it conveniently does. Because the blade goes warm when you are near, and I have learned in 6 weeks to trust that blade more than most of my advisors, and it appears to have an opinion about where it should be." He met her eyes with the same steady attention she gave everything that required care. "And because someone should be present while you figure out the answer to that question. Even if it takes a long time." Maren looked at him. She looked at the blade. She looked at her hand in her lap, at the base of her palm where the warmth moved faintly when she was near the steel. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She did not have the vocabulary yet for what this was, which was the most honest thing she had felt in 6 weeks, and possibly in 12 years before that. She looked at the fire. The blade at his hip held its warmth steadily. She thought, with the careful clinical part of her mind that never fully stopped working, that this was what it felt like when something that had been empty for a long time registered the first arrival of something that might, in time, fill it. She did not say that. She kept it where it was, quiet and careful and still finding its edges. But she did not ask him to leave. That was its own kind of answer. The fire kept burning, and the room was warm, and for the first time in 6 weeks Marion could not be certain whether the warmth she felt was the fire in front of her or the blade at his side or something that had been waiting, quietly and without announcement, to be let back in. She sat with it. She did not move her hand.